Welcome to Sleepy Case Files, a place where quiet storytelling meets mysterious cases. Tonight, we slowly explore a story from the world of true crime. The American Midwest during the early 20th century is frequently remembered as an idyllic, peaceful landscape. It was a time and place where neighbors relied heavily upon one another. Exterior doors remained unlocked long after sunset and violent. Random crime was largely a distant rumor relegated to the newspapers of major distant cities. However, on June 10, 1912, the quiet, prosperous town of Villisca, Iowa, lost its innocence permanently. Over the course of one single night, 8 lives were brutally extinguished inside a modest white frame house situated on East 2nd Street. One killer, or perhaps multiple killers, methodically bludgeoned 6 members of the Moore family and 2 young neighborhood girls to death while they slept in their beds. More than 100 years later, the slaughter remains one of the most horrific, confounding, and fiercely debated unsolved mass murders in the history of the United States. To understand the sheer magnitude of the shock and terror that completely paralyzed Villisca, one must thoroughly understand the victims and their established standing within the local community. In 1912, Villisca was a thriving, bustling agricultural hub located in Montgomery County, boasting a population of approximately 2,000 residents. Josiah B. Moore, age 43, was widely considered one of the town's most prominent and respected citizens. He was an ambitious, highly successful businessman who owned and managed a lucrative retail store selling farm implements and hardware. His sharp business acumen and friendly demeanor provided a deeply comfortable upper-middle-class life for his family. Josiah was married to Sarah Moore, age 39. Together, they were raising 4 children: Herman, age 11, Catherine, age 10, Boyd, age 7, and Paul, age 5. The Moores were undeniably considered pillars of their local society. They were devoutly religious, deeply involved in community affairs, and highly active members of the local Presbyterian Church. June 9, 1912, fell on a Sunday. It was a particularly significant and joyous date for the church congregation, as it was designated as the annual Children's Day service. Sarah Moore had spent several weeks tirelessly helping the congregation organize the elaborate event. Her 4 children, along with over 30 other local youths, participated in the evening program, which featured Bible recitations, musical performances, and one large theatrical play. Also present at the church that evening were 2 sisters who lived in the Moores' immediate neighborhood: Lena Stillinger, age 12, and Ina Stillinger, age 8. The Stillinger girls were close companions of Catherine Moore. Because the evening program ran quite late, finally concluding around 9:30 p.m., the Stillinger parents permitted their 2 daughters to spend the night at the Moore household, rather than walking home through the dark, unlit dirt streets. It was a seemingly innocent, practical decision that ultimately sealed their tragic fates. Around 9:45 p.m., the Moore family, accompanied by the 2 Stillinger girls, walked the 3 short blocks from the Presbyterian Church to their home on East 2nd Street. They entered the house, locked the exterior doors against the nighttime chill, and prepared for bed. The weather was cool and damp. By 10:30 p.m., all 8 occupants were asleep in their respective rooms. they would never see the sun rise again. The following morning began like any other ordinary Monday in Montgomery County. Next door to the Moore residence lived an elderly woman named Mary Peckham. Around 7 a.m., Mary stepped onto her porch to begin her daily routine of household chores. She almost immediately registered that something was profoundly wrong at the house next door. The Moore house was entirely unnervingly silent. Typically by 7 a.m., the residence was a loud hive of morning activity. Josiah would be preparing his horses to leave for his implement store. Sarah would be hanging damp laundry on the line or cooking a large breakfast, and the 4 children would be outside completing their morning chores in the yard. On this specific morning, however, there was no movement. The window curtains were tightly drawn shut, and the exterior doors remained firmly closed. Mary Peckham waited patiently, hoping to see a sign of life. By 8 a.m., her mild concern had blossomed into genuine anxiety. She walked across the damp yard to the Moore house and knocked loudly on the front door. She received no answer. She tried turning the doorknob, but it was locked securely from the inside. She even opened the Moore's chicken coop to let the birds out, hoping the resulting noise would rouse someone inside the home. Still, absolutely nothing happened. Increasingly frantic, Mary Peckham returned to her own home and placed a telephone call to Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, who owned a local drugstore in town. Ross Moore arrived at the property shortly after 8 a.m. He banged heavily on the door and shouted for his brother. Receiving no response, he retrieved a spare key from his key ring, unlocked the front door, and tentatively stepped into the shadowy house. Ross Moore walked slowly into the parlor, immediately noticing the unusually heavy metallic scent in the air. He then pushed open the door to the downstairs guest bedroom. In the dim light filtering through the covered windows, he saw 2 forms under a blood-soaked sheet on the bed. Without pulling back the linens to identify the victims, the completely terrified Ross Moore immediately backed out of the room, ran out the front door, and yelled for Mary Peckham to summon the town marshal. Marshal Hank Horton arrived at the property shortly after 8:30 a.m. He entered the home alone to investigate the terrifying scene. When he emerged onto the front porch several minutes later, his face was completely pale and drawn. He looked at Ross Moore and delivered a horrifying summary of what he had found. He stated there was somebody murdered in every bed. The crime scene Marshal Horton discovered was a total nightmare of systematic brutality. The perpetrator or perpetrators had methodically moved through the 2-story house, leaving 8 shattered bodies in the dark. In the downstairs guest bedroom lay the 2 Stillinger girls, Lena and Ina. Upstairs in the primary bedroom were Josiah and Sarah Moore. In the adjacent children's room down the hall were the 4 Moore children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. All 8 victims had been bludgeoned in the head with an axe. Dr. F.S. Williams, the local coroner, determined the attacks occurred between 12 a.m. and 5 a.m. The killer struck with extreme ferocity, entirely crushing the victims' skulls. Josiah Moore's blows were so severe his eyes were missing, and the axe blade gouged deep marks into the wooden ceiling above the bed. The murder weapon was found resting against a wall in the downstairs guest room, where the 2 Stillinger girls slept. It was Josiah Moore's own axe, a 4-pound tool he regularly used for chopping firewood in the backyard. The weapon was heavily coated in blood and brain matter. The killer had seemingly attempted to wipe the wooden handle clean, though largely unsuccessfully. The sheer physical violence was only one facet of the profound mystery. The killer had left behind a bizarre, highly ritualistic series of clues that pointed to a deeply disturbed psychological state. First, all the mirrors and door windows were covered with clothing. Second, the killer had drawn the curtains in every room to block out natural light. Third, a 2-pound slab of unsliced bacon was found lying on the floor in the guest bedroom near the axe. A similar piece was missing from the icebox, suggesting the killer retrieved it after the murders. Fourth, a pan of bloody water was discovered on the kitchen table, indicating the killer washed their hands before leaving. Fifth, and most chillingly, the killer meticulously covered the mutilated faces of all 8 victims with bedclothes after the murders. Dr. Williams noted one specific detail that suggested at least one victim had briefly awakened during the massacre. Lena Stillinger, the 12-year-old girl, was found lying horizontally across the bed, her body pushed defensively against the wall. She had a visible defensive wound on her arm, and her undergarments had been removed and discarded under the bed. However, the coroner found no conclusive forensic evidence of a sexual assault. It appeared the killer's primary motivation was total, unadulterated annihilation of the family unit. In 1912, the science of forensics was still in its absolute infancy. Fingerprinting was rarely utilized outside of major metropolitan police departments, and DNA analysis was decades away from being discovered. Crime scene preservation protocols were virtually non-existent in rural America. In Villisca, the immediate response to the murders became a textbook example of how to thoroughly destroy a crime scene and ruin any chance of a swift conviction. News of the massacre spread through the small town like wildfire. By 10 a.m., over 100 people had gathered on the lawn of the Moore house. Because the tiny local police force was completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of the event, they failed to secure the perimeter or lock the doors to the public. Over the next 12 hours, an estimated 100 townspeople walked freely through the house to gawk at the horrific scene. These onlookers touched the furniture, they picked up objects, they moved items in the kitchen. A local man even pocketed a fragment of a victim's shattered skull as a morbid, grotesque souvenir. By the time state investigators and bloodhounds finally arrived from Omaha, Nebraska, the crime scene was entirely compromised. The bloodhounds were brought in to track the killer's scent, but the trail was completely masked by the footprints of 100 curious locals who had trampled the yard. Any potential fingerprints inside the home were wiped away or covered by the prints of neighbors. The killer had slipped away into the night, locking the doors behind them and taking the house keys. They left town as silently as they had arrived, leaving behind no clear motives, no witnesses, and a police force grappling with the most complex, contaminated case in Iowa history. Panic completely gripped the region. Hardware stores across Montgomery County sold out of locks, heavy bolts, and firearms within 24 hours. Families refused to sleep alone in their isolated farmhouses, instead gathering in large groups of 10 or 15 people in a single house, standing guard with loaded shotguns throughout the night. The state of Iowa offered a $1,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. Local agencies pooled resources to add another $2,000. Over 20 private detectives, some highly competent, others obvious frauds, descended upon Villisca. Suspects were arrested across the Midwest simply for looking disheveled or for carrying an axe in their wagon. Every transient riding the railroad lines within a 50-mile radius was detained and interrogated. Slowly, the chaotic investigation began to focus on a few key individuals. Over the next 10 years, 3 primary suspects emerged, tearing the town of Villisca apart and sparking bitter feuds that lasted for generations. The first major theory centered on a prominent local figure, State Senator Frank F. Jones. Jones was arguably the wealthiest man in Villisca. For many years, Josiah Moore had been his star employee. However, in 1907, 5 years before the murders, Josiah Moore left and opened a competing farm implement store. Moore successfully secured the lucrative John Deere franchise, taking it away from Jones. This sparked a bitter rivalry where the two men refused to speak. A private detective named James Newton Wilkerson theorized that Jones hired a hitman named William Mansfield to eliminate his rival. Mansfield was a criminal from Illinois. Wilkerson claimed Mansfield was in Villisca on June 9th and pointed out that Mansfield's own wife, infant child, and father-in-law were murdered with an axe in Illinois 2 years later. In 1916, Mansfield was arrested. However, a grand jury refused to indict him because he produced payroll records proving he was working at a plant over 300 miles away in Illinois on the night of the murders. Wilkerson's theory collapsed, but nearly 50% of the town continued to believe Frank Jones orchestrated the massacre. The second major suspect was a traveling minister named Reverend George Kelly. Kelly was an eccentric, deeply troubled man who suffered from severe mental breakdowns. He was confirmed to be in Villisca on the day of the murders, attending the Children's Day service and sitting directly across from the Moore family. Kelly left Villisca on an early morning train on June 10th, departing between 5 a.m. and 6 a.m., hours before the bodies were discovered. In 1917, exactly 5 years after the crime, Kelly was arrested and confessed after hours of interrogation, claiming God commanded him to strike down the children. However, he immediately recanted. After 2 trials, a jury acquitted him, believing his confession was coerced due to his fragile mental state. A third chilling theory suggests the murders were the work of a transient serial killer between 1911 and 1912. A string of brutally similar axe murders occurred along the railroad lines of the American Midwest. In every single case, the killer used an axe belonging to the victims, covered the windows, covered the mirrors, and covered the faces of the victims. Federal investigators noted the striking similarities and theorized that one single man was responsible for over 30 deaths across 4 states. However, law enforcement agencies in 1912 didn't share information across state lines, and the connections were never formally investigated. The Villisca axe murders broke the fundamental spirit of the town. The massive investigations and bitter trials pitted neighbor against neighbor. Today, more than 100 years later, the Moore House still stands on its original foundation on East 2nd Street, preserved exactly as it looked in 1912. It contains no electricity and no running water, drawing thousands of true crime enthusiasts every single year. The true identity of the monster who walked the dirt streets of Villisca on that dark Sunday night remains an elusive mystery. It serves as a terrifying historical reminder that sometimes the most profound evil goes entirely unpunished. The case remains open, completely cold, and forever unsolved.